Good afternoon. My name is Eugene Leventhal, and I am an incoming MSPPM student here at Hines College. And I'm sending in this video for the SPS exemption consideration. And in addition to my forthcoming work at Carnegie Mellon, I'm also the CEO and founder of EduDAO, which is a nonprofit that that uses blockchain for crowdfunding as well as for community building for schools and related nonprofits. So I'm here today to give a quick presentation on Blockchain 101, not focusing too much on the intricacies of the technology, but more focusing at a high level on how does the technology work, what it is applicable for, and specifically in the context of social impact and social change. But before really jumping into sort of the high level overview of how blockchain technology works or what it's being used for in the social context, I wanted to kind of take a step back and focus on demystifying the technology a little bit, because a lot of the time uh, blockchain is sort of being presented as something so tremendously new and such a strong improvement to any transaction kind of equipment or platforms of yesteryear that it's sort of being led on to be this absolutely new thing, which, in my opinion, makes it a little more challenging to sort of understand at the high level. So, I think it's very important to realize that blockchain is actually building on a number of technologies that have existed anywhere from a couple of years to a couple of decades. And these technologies include cloud computing, mobile, game theory, peer-to-peer networks, distributed computing in general, and very importantly, cryptography. And irrespective of whether or not you're familiar with all of those things, it's just important to understand that blockchain isn't entirely new. It's not this thing that just appeared out of nowhere. It's something that's been building on 5, 6, 7 different types of theories or technologies that, again, have existed for decades. So I think it's important to realize that, because, say, when we look at something like computing or the beginning of the internet or commercial internet, at least in the early 90s, which is a analogy that frequently gets drawn to sort of the landscape and the environment around blockchain at this point. It's sort of the Wild West as it was in the early 90s with the internet. It's important to understand that the internet had sort of a 30, 40 year runway before it actually got to that point. Whereas it seems like the way blockchain gets talked about as though it's something that's so new that, again, it just appeared out of nowhere. And I think that that's very misleading in terms of the reality of how this technology came about. And, being on the point of the internet, I think it's important to understand that our technological depth and understanding is also a bit relative. We're all very comfortable with mobile phones, with the internet, with the idea of sending emails or being able to purchase and have something delivered to us tomorrow via our mobile phones or something like that. But the reality is that if we kind of try to break down the basics of, say, if I send you an email, what is the actual technology behind that? What's going on between my phone, between the Google server if I'm using Gmail, and whatever server that you might be using, and whatever internet client you might be using if you're using Outlook or any other one. So a lot of the time we kind of get caught up with new technologies with the ideas of, oh, I may not understand the intricacies, I don't really know how it works, and that leads to a reticence towards wanting to use it, or towards becoming an early adopter, when in reality, again, even if we look at email or texting or making a phone call from our cell phone, the vast majority of us don't really know the technological underpinnings of that. We know that it works. And I think that folks get caught up a little bit with the hype and with the fact that, blockchain is being ushered as this kind of groundbreaking, revolutionary thing, that I think it's easy to get swept up in sort of all the buzzwords and all the change, and not focus on the fact that this is an incremental change of technologies that have been being developed for decades, and it's just providing us a new type of functionality, which, in my opinion, at its core is digitizing trust. That it's pretty much embedding trust into the blockchain system, into any system where you can transact two things of value between two folks that don't trust each other. And, that might not seem like a big deal, but when you think why third parties exist in the first place, when I want to send you money, It's because whether I do not trust you as an individual or I do not trust the method of getting the, say, $20 from my account to your account, something like blockchain is meant to weed that out and is meant to create a platform that is secure and transparent so that we can feel comfortable in doing these things. And so moving along to what is blockchain, again, at a high level, I don't really want to focus on the in-depth breakdown of the technology because I think that can sort of be misleading from the applications. And again, to my previous point, I think it's much more important to think of what can we do with this technology as opposed to getting caught up with, well, I want to understand every little element of how it works. Again, because we don't have that depth of understanding with a lot of the technology that's prevalent in our lives. So I hope that we can apply the same lack of bias towards this new technology as well. So what is blockchain? Blockchain a lot of the time is talked about in the context of financial transactions, which is very understandable given that the first ever blockchain platform to exist was the Bitcoin blockchain, which is a cryptocurrency. And the reason that it came about, the white paper came out in late 2008. It actually started running live as a platform by early 2009. The goal of it was to create a currency that did not need middlemen, that did not need a third-party organization, whether it's a sovereign nation or a major local or international banking institution, if we want to send each other money. And it's sort of a groundbreaking thing. And when we talk about the use cases, I'll bring up two examples. But the ability to sort of leapfrog traditional banking infrastructure and just move to a blockchain world is very exciting because it offers the opportunity of not having to get banks everywhere, not having to go the traditional system, which a lot of the time, especially when we think of remittances overseas or any kind of overseas transaction, the traditional banking system can rack up a tremendous amount of fees. Which, when looking at folks that might be sending money home from say Western Europe or from the Americas back to folks in Asia or in Africa or in anywhere else that may not have as developed an infrastructure, when they're sending money back, they can lose anywhere between 15, 20, or even upwards of that percent just in terms of getting the money back to their relatives, which is a huge shame because realistically, those are the folks that really need every cent. They're the folks dealing with poor infrastructure back home that may live in areas where there aren't many resources available, and so it's a shame to see so many of the funds sort of being lost along the way just to third parties and just to middlemen. And so blockchain came about because of this idea again of how do we cut out these middlemen. And the way to best think of blockchain, it's frequently mentioned as a ledger of information or as a database of information, but I think there's a few terms that can loosely be applied to it to help us understand what blockchain does. And though it's not a database in a traditional sense, but it is a store of information because everything that gets transacted, whether that's money, whether that's land rights, whether it's the intellectual property rights to something like music or digital art, whether it's something like crowdfunding money for nonprofit causes is something that we're doing, the blockchain does offer a sort of database functionality of storing the information of everything that gets transferred. And so it is fair to think of blockchain as sort of this database or as this ledger with these immutable blocks of data. Where the name comes from, blockchain, it's a chain of blocks of information. Whenever transactions start occurring, the information gets put together into a block of information, and each block gets added to this chain that is sort of builds on top of each other, where every single block is related to the block before it and the block after it. And so once you have a long chain like the Bitcoin blockchain, if we wanted to go back and try to falsify some earlier entry, we would in turn have to alter the entire chain before a new transaction goes through and everyone sort of approves the current state of the blockchain, which, as you may be thinking, is almost technically infeasible. Unless you're a nation state or you happen to be the biggest player in a certain area, like with Bitcoin, if you've ever heard of some large miners potentially reaching the 51% threshold, which is having more than half of the system's computing power, at which point you could theoretically alter the blockchain. The organizations aren't incentivized to do that because if you're theoretically, if you can control that much of the computing power, that's because you have a huge stake in the system. And taking the example of Bitcoin, if there's any miner that controls that much and they're mining that much, chances are the amount of money that they're making from the Bitcoin mining and from holding Bitcoin and its long term growth will outweigh the potential benefits of trying to disrupt and falsify any records and disrupt the blockchain overall and add a huge question mark to the system as a whole, because it would completely diminish the value of their own holdings and the revenues that they're making and the currency, within which they're making their money. So that's sort of part of the genius of blockchain, and why it includes game theory is to make sure that everyone's incentivized to be a good actor to each other. Another important term with blockchain is the idea of distributed computing. Traditionally, we came from a world of centralized computing, centralized transaction, where there was one place where all information was stored. If we wanted to get money from a bank, even, we had to physically go to that single bank that existed in our neighborhood or in our town, and that was how we could get our money. As time went on, we moved from a centralized world to more of a decentralized world where, continuing with the bank example, yes, maybe JP Morgan Chase has my checking money. However, I don't need to go to a single JP Morgan Chase. I can go to any one of their vendors, any one of their banks or ATMs, from which they access their central database and allow me to not, again, be bottlenecked by that single location, but I can access it from any of the points in the system. The idea of distributed computing is when every single individual or every single group on this platform or using this technology has the full record of information. So with Bitcoin, when we can all see all of the transactions that are happening, we don't necessarily need that centralized third party as much, because what they do is make sure that money is truly going from where it's supposed to where it's supposed to. But if we're operating in a distributed and open system, we can all see that. And the miners, who are the ones validating transactions, are incentivized to make sure that everyone else is doing the correct things, so they keep tabs on each other. So it's sort of finding a way to, again, embed trust in the system and encourage folks to trust each other and keep tabs on each other via this open and transparent system. And I think that with this idea of, it being a distributed database of information, we can kind of take a look at a high level of how it works. And, we can take Bitcoin as an example, but realistically, any type of blockchain platform will have this essence to it, with one major difference between some of the blockchain platforms being whether it's an open and publicly available system or whether it's a permission system. Something like the Bitcoin platform, the Bitcoin blockchain, the Ethereum blockchain, which is the one that EduDAO is currently building on, or some of the other ones, they are considered open and public blockchains. However, there are also permissioned ones like the Hyperledger, which is being run by the Linux Foundation, but also had major contributions from IBM and dozens of other tech and finance companies as well. And so the goal of Hyperledger is more for the corporate enterprise environment, where realistically, if banks are transacting billions or trillions of dollars of value, they don't want the average user on the system being able to access all that information for privacy's sake, or also just for potentially exposing some of the sort of business elements of the transactions and what they can be showing about the positions of a bank, and give away some sensitive information in that way. So the major corporate enterprises, they're much more interested in a permission system where they can work as a community, where, say, all the banks together can choose a few individuals from each bank who can then keep tabs on all of these trades and make sure that everything is going as it should be. So, at a high level, how does it work? First, some kind of transaction. So all of this is about a transaction of anything of value. Again, that doesn't just have to be money. It can be anything else which we're using the blockchain for. But here, let's just assume it is actual money, and we can use Bitcoin as an example. So first, some transaction needs to be initiated. I, Eugene, want to send money to you, and that is sort of the initiation of the transaction. We go through whatever client we want to use. Say Coinbase is a popular Bitcoin and Ethereum wallet. So you can go on your Coinbase account and say that I want to send money to you. And so that initiates the transaction where the data block actually gets formed. And then once this block is formed, it needs to be validated. In the case of Bitcoin, that's via miners, which are all incentivized to validate these blocks because that's actually how they make money. However, there are other systems, as I mentioned, where that validation mechanism can be privatized and can look a little different. But again, we don't have to get lost in the nuances of how it works. The goal is one person wants to send something to another. That forms a block of data. Someone within the network, whether they're incentivized by making money directly or sort of because that's their job, they're hired to do that kind of role. They validate the transaction. They say that I, Eugene, really have this money, and they can check my account really quickly, given the public and private addresses that we put out. Excuse me, only the public address that we put out, and they can validate that I truly have this money, and they can validate that you are a real user on the system, and that this money will go to you, and it will adjust our accounts. And then once they validate it, all of that happens to go through. And the beauty of it is that it's instantaneous. And in the financial services arena, one area that's very exciting for blockchain application is the idea of post-trade settlement. Because right now in the United States, we're at T+3, we're at trade plus 3 business days. Whereas using blockchain, we can theoretically get to T+0 because all of this would instantaneously settle. If the validation happens sort of instantly, where whether it's the DTCC, which is sort of the current body that manages a lot of the trades, or any other organization, whether they are the ones still validating in this blockchain-enabled future, or again, there's some kind of more distributed system about it. Once a trade gets validated, the assets automatically move, so we don't need that extra time to wait. And again, when thinking more in a social context and in the context of remittances, that's also a big deal. Because right now, via Western Union or some traditional platforms, it could take some time for the money to transfer. And not only that, the folks actually have to go out to the location, whether it's a Western Union or whatever brick and mortar location, to get that money. And so it's exciting to see some use cases coming up where they're sort of, again, leapfrogging that physical infrastructure. And an organization like Abra, which started in the Philippines, between the West and Philippines, and I know they've expanded since, or BitPesa, which uses the M-Pesa mobile network in Kenya. These are both great examples of remittance applications using blockchain. And so for Abra, which I think is a really cool one, the idea there is if I'm sending money to a relative or a friend back in the Philippines, once I transfer them Bitcoin, great, they now have this Bitcoin. But in reality, especially if they're living in, say, a smaller, more remote city or village in the Philippines, they may not have access to vendors which accept Bitcoin. So what do they do with this Bitcoin? They can actually trade via the Abra platform with someone who has local currency who may want Bitcoin for whatever reason. And the platform itself limits the amount of fees that can be charged. But that's pretty powerful that if I send money to my relative, that relative can then put a bid out to everyone in their region to say, hey, I have Bitcoin and I want a different currency. Who wants to do the opposite trade? Who has the currency I want and wants Bitcoin? And they can see what is sort of the buy and asks that are being put out there, and they can choose to trade directly with individuals. And so by creating this sort of distributed currency trading for the purpose of remittances, that really creates a system with a sub 3% fee versus what would traditionally be 15+%, plus the time and expense it would take to get to the brick and mortar location where they could actually secure the funds. So that's a pretty powerful tool. Some other applications that are also very important are identity recognition or identity validation, such as Uport or other ones. And one example of how an identity solution has recently been utilized is actually with Syrian refugees, where they paired with a biometrics reading company. I believe they were a London-based biometrics company, and they would issue the UN, I believe it was UN Aid, would issue sort of blockchain-based certificates of how many food tickets, let's say, a refugee would have. And then when a refugee would come in to cash some of the goods that they were supposed to have, they can actually have their iris scanned, and that deducts from their account. And so being able to lend identity to those who may not have a set bank account, who do not have a government passport, who do not have a government issued license, that's huge, because that lack of identity, that lack of proof of ownership of the things in your own life, is actually one of the biggest inhibiting factors in financial inclusivity. And so there's almost 2 billion people on earth, that between 1.5 and 2 billion people, which for those kind of reasons are excluded from the financial system and being able to access banking or credit or other resources. So the combination of some of these blockchain based financial companies, as well as identity and credential validation, the fusion of those two ideas is very powerful, because it again allows individuals to skip waiting for physical infrastructure to get built, and they immediately become empowered to prove who they are, what they own, and then trade those assets with other individuals. And another one that sort of may not seem as much of a social impact idea off the bat, but I think is powerful in terms of its use case, is an organization called Ujo Music, which is also built on Ethereum. And there, anyone who takes part in the creative process of creating a song gets digitally encoded for X% of ownership. So let's just say that you and I both create a song and we each contributed half of it, so we each have a 50% ownership of this song. Every time someone purchased this song, we instantly get paid out half of that amount. So let's just say the song costs $1. Bob buys this song. We immediately get paid out 50 cents each. We don't have to wait for the traditional royalty cycle, which would take anywhere from 6 to 24 months. So that's clearly an application in the creative artistic space, but that isn't just excluded to or limited to music. That's to anything of intellectual property, whether it is something creative, it is something of self-expression, or it could be something like patents or any other kind of new ideas, or even our own data. Because if we think of Facebook or social media in the current paradigm, we sort of give away all of our privacy and all of our data rights to these organizations, whether it's Facebook, Google, or whoever else, for our benefit of being able to use their technology. However, in a blockchain enabled future, if we imagine a blockchain based Facebook, we might have to pay to use Facebook in the form of giving them access to some of our data, or we could just pay a fee to use Facebook, this blockchain enabled Facebook, without them actually getting any of our data. So the ability to add blockchain to our digital lives is also a big deal, because it gives us the opportunity to be the owners of our digital identities, and to then have more accountability for ourselves for what we do in terms of our own digital data, our medical data, or anything else of ours that we sort of accumulate with time in this way. So there are many other applications of blockchain, ranging from the transfer of energy. So if there's an individual who's outfitted their home with clean energy and with solar energy, and they have a good system of storing some of that, they can actually trade the energy directly to their neighbors, so that their neighbors can feed off of them instead of off the overall energy grid. There's also blockchain solutions around provenance, whether it's around the diamond trade in the diamond industry, whether it's something like the bovine farming. I know Walmart has an application where they're actually tracking all of their cow farming and cow purchases on the blockchain, so that if there is ever an outbreak of any kind of disease, they can exactly pinpoint to what factory and immediately track all the other cows that went out in that batch, and immediately see where those cows ended up going, where the meat from those cows ended up going, and so they can make a recall in a much more effective fashion. And so, even with just this brief description of the technology and some of the use cases, we're seeing a lot of opportunities here of how we can use this sort of trusted system of passing things of value between individuals or between entities, to empower individuals to own more of their own goods and to reap the benefits of their own actions. And so I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation. And if there are ever any questions in terms of blockchain in the social impact context or otherwise, I would be more than happy to answer them. And you can please feel free to reach out to me with any of those. Thank you again for your time, and I hope that you enjoy your weekend and week. Thank you.